so vague about the refit. Her old mentor knew her entirely too well. He knew exactly how she would have reacted if he told her the truth, and he wasn't about to let her throw her first cruiser command in a fit of temper. She shook herself and rose to stretch, and Nimitz roused to look her way. He started to slither down from the padded dress to her new steward and rigged in her little crest, but she waved him back with the soft sound which told him she had to think. He cocked his head for a moment, then blinked quietly at her and settled back down. She took a quick turn about the cabin. That was one nice thing about Fearless. At less than 90,000 tons, she might be small by modern standards, but the captain's quarters were downright spacious compared to Hawkins. Still small and cramped in planet-side eyes, perhaps, but Honor hadn't applied planetary standards to her living space in years. She'd even had her own dining apartment, large enough to seat all of her officers for formal occasions, and that was a luxury indeed aboard a warship. Not that spaciousness made her feel any better about the ghastly mutilation Festus was wreaking upon her lovely ship. She paused to adjust the golden black on the bulkhead by her desk. There was a fingerprint on the polished alloy, and she felt a familiar, wry self-amusement as she leaned closer to burnish it away with her sleeve. That black had accompanied her from ship to ship and planet-side and back for 12.5 years, and she would have felt lost without it. It was a good luck piece, her totem. She rubbed a fingertip gently across the long, tapering wing of the sailplane etched into the gold, remembering the day she'd landed to discover she'd set a new Academy record, one that still stood for combined altitude, duration, and aerobatics, and she smiled. But the smile faded as she glanced through the open internal hatch into the dining compartment and returned to the depressing present. She sighed again. She wasn't looking forward to that dinner. For that matter, she wasn't looking forward to her tour of the ship after what she'd found locked away in her computer. The happiness she'd felt in such a short time ago had soured, and what should have been two of the more pleasurable rituals of a change of command looked far less inviting now. She told McCain she meant to study the ship's books, and so she had, but her main intention had been focused on the refit specs and the detailed instructions she'd found in the captain's secure database. McCain's description of the alterations was only too accurate, though he had mentioned that in addition to ripping out 2/3 of Fearless's missile tubes, the yard was gutting her magazine space as well. Missile stowage was always a problem, particularly for smaller starships like light cruisers and destroyers, because an impeller drive missile simply had to be big. There were limits to how many you could cram aboard, and since they decided to reduce Fearless's tubes, they'd see no reason not to reduce her magazines as well. After all, it had let them cram in four additional energy torpedo launchers. She felt her lips trying to curl into a snarl and forced them to smooth as Nimitz chattered a question at her. The tree cat's vocal apparatus was woefully inserted to form in words. That was no problem with other cats, since they relied so heavily on their ill-understood telepathic sense for communications, but it left many humans prone to underestimate their intelligence badly. Honor knew better, and Nimitz was always sensitive to her moods. Indeed, she suspected he knew her better than she knew herself, and she took a moment to scratch the underside of his jaw before she resumed her pacing. It was all quite simple, she thought. She'd fallen into the clutches of horrible Hempel and her crowd, and now it was up to her to make their stupidity look intelligent. She gritted her teeth. There were two major schools of tactical thought in the RMA. The traditionalists, championed by Admiral Hamish and Alexander, and Admiral of the Red, Lady Sonia Hempel. Alexander, and for that matter Honor, believed the fundamental tactical truths remained true regardless of weapon systems, that it was a matter of fitting new weapons into existing conceptual frameworks with due adjustment for the capabilities they conferred. That Nicole believed weapons determined tactics, and that technology, properly used, rendered historical analysis irrelevant. And, unfortunately, politics had placed Honorable Hempel and her Venetian merchants in the ascendant just now. Honor suppressed an uncharacteristic urge to swear viciously. She didn't study politics, she didn't understand politics, and she didn't like politics. But even she grasped it. Her property Confronted by the liberals and progressives' inflexible opposition to big-ticket military budgets and sides, the so-called new men were inclined towards temporary alliance with them. Duke Allen had been forced to draw the Conservative Association into his camp as a counterweight. It was unlikely the conservatives would stay put. Their xenophobic isolationism and protectionism were too fundamentally at odds with the concentrists and crown loyalists' perception that open war with the People's Republic of Haven was inevitable. But for now they were needed, and they'd charged time for their allegiance. They'd wanted the military minister, and Duke Allen had been forced to buy them off by naming Sir Edward Janisek First Lord of the Admiralty. The civilian had to honor his own service under the ministry war. Janisek had been an admiral at this time, and one with a reputation for toughness and determination, but a more reactionary old xenophobe would be hard to find. It was one of the group who had opposed the annexation of the Basilisk terminus and Mandalore Junction on the grounds that it would antagonize our neighbors. Translated, it would be the first step on the road to foreign adventurism. And that was bad. Unpolitical honor might be, but she knew which party she supported. The centrists realized that the Republic of Haven's expansionism must inevitably bring it into conflict with the kingdom, and they were preparing to do something about it. The conservatives wanted to bury their heads in the sand till it all went away, that they were at least willing to support a powerful fleet to safeguard their precious isolation. But the point which most affected Fearless just now was that Hemphill was Janisek's second cousin, and that Janisek personally disliked Admiral Alexander more. The new First Lord feared the traditionalist insistence that aggressive expansions like Haven's would continue until it was forcibly contained. And finally, Hemphill was one of the most senior admirals of the Red. Each of the armamen's flag rings was divided into two divisions on the basis of seniority. The junior half of each ring was admirals of the Red, or Griffin Division, while the senior halves were admirals of the Green, or Mandalore Division. Simple longevity would eventually move any flag officer from one division to the other, but they could also be promoted over the heads of their fellows, and with her cousin as First Lord, Lady Sonia was poised to move up to the Green, especially if she could justify her tactical theories, all of which, added together, had given Hemphill the clout to butcher Honor's hapless ship. She growled and kicked a stool across the cabin. The satisfaction was purely momentary, and she flung herself back into her chair to glower at her screen. Her command, it seemed, was her reward for graduating first in Admiral Cavazier's advanced tactics class, for Fearless was also Hemphill's secret weapon in the upcoming fleet program. That explained the security clamp over the refit, which Cavazier had made his excuse for not wanting honor, and she didn't doubt that Hempill was chuckling and rubbing her hands in anticipation. For herself, if Honor had known he was waiting, she darn well would have blown off a couple of percentage points just to avoid him. She rubbed her eyes again, wondering if McKean already knew about their role in the fleet problem. Probably not. He hadn't been upset enough, given what it was going to do to their efficiency ratings and, beyond a doubt, the Fearless's reputation. The problem was that, on paper, the whole thing made sense. Gravity sidewells were the first and primary line of defense for every warship. The impeller drive created a pair of stressed gravity bands above and below a ship, a wedge open at both ends, though the forward edge was far deeper than the after one, capable in theory of instant acceleration to light speed. Of course, that kind of acceleration would turn any crew to gory goo, even with modern inertial compensators. The best acceleration any warship could pull on the impeller was well under 600 gravities, but it had been a tremendous step forward, and not simply in terms of propulsion. Even today, no known weapon could penetrate the main drive bands of military-grade impeller wedge, which meant simply powering its impellers protected a ship against any fire from above or below. But that had left the sides of the impeller wedge, for they too were open, until someone invented the gravity sidewell and extended protections to its flanks. The bow and stern aspects still couldn't be closed, even by a sidewall, and the most powerful sidewall ever generated was far weaker than a drive band. Sidewalls could be penetrated, particularly by missiles fitted penetration aids, but it took a powerful energy weapon at very short range, relatively speaking, to pierce them with any effort, and that limited beams to a range of no more than 400,000 kilometers. It also meant that deep space battles had a nasty tendency to end in tactical draws, however important they might be strategically. When one fleet realized it was in trouble, it simply turned its ship up on their sides, presenting only the impenetrable aspects of its individual units' impeller wedges, while it endeavored to break off the action. The only counter was a resolute pursuit, but that, in turn, exposed the unguarded frontal arms of the pursuer's wedge, inviting raking fire straight down their throats as they attempted to close. Cruiser actions were more often fought to the finish, but engagements between capital ships all too often had the formalism of some intricate dance in which both sides knew all the steps. The situation had remained unaltered for 6 standard centuries, aside from changes in engagement range as beam weapons improved or defensive designers came up with a new wrinkle to make missile penetration more difficult. And Hempel and her technophiliacs found that intolerable. They believed the Grablands could break the static situation, and they were determined to prove it. In theory, Honor had to concede the point. In theory, deep inside she even wished, rather wistfully, that they might be right, for the tactician in her hated the thought of bloody formalistic battles. The proper objective was the enemy's fleet, not simple territory. If his battle squadrons lived to fight another day, one was forced back on a strategy of attrition and blockade, and casualties ultimately were far higher in that sort of grinding war. Yet the Jean de Gaulle wasn't right. The Grablands was new and might, indeed, someday have the potential Hempel claimed for it, but it certainly didn't have it yet. With only a very little luck, a direct hit could set up a harmonic fit to burn out any sidewall generator, but it was a cumbersome, slow-firing, mass-intensive weapon, and its maximum range under optimum circumstances was barely 100,000 kilometers, and that, she thought gloomily, was the critical flaw. To employ the lance, a ship had to close to point-blank range against enemies who would start trying to kill it with missiles at upwards of 1,000,000 kilometers and chime in with energy weapons of 4 times the lance's own range. It might even make sense aboard a capital ship with the mass to spare for it, but only an idiot or a horrible Hempel would think it made sense aboard a light cruiser. Fearless simply didn't have the defensive to survive hostile fire as she closed, and thanks to the Grablands, she no longer even had the offensive weapons to reply effectively. Oh, certainly, if she got in the Grablands' range and if the lance did its job, the massive energy torpedo batteries Hempel had crammed in could tear even a super dreadnought apart, but only if the lance did its job, since energy torpedoes were as effective as so many soft-boiled eggs against an intact sidewall. It was insane, and it was up to Honor to make it work. She glowered at the screen some more, then switched it off in disgust and sprawled up tightly across the bed. Nimitz stretched and ambled down from his rest to curl up on her stomach, and this time she peered to him and stroked his fur as he laid his jaw on her breastbone to help her think. She'd considered protesting. After all, tradition gave a captain the authority to question alterations to her command, but Fearless hadn't been her command. Whether even it was authorized, and the right to question whether it wasn't the same as the right to refuse. Honor knew exactly how Hempel would react to any protest, and it was too late to undo the damage anyway. Besides, she had her orders. However stupid they were, it was her job to make them work, and that, as they said at the academy, was that. Even if it hadn't been, Fearless was her ship, by God, whatever Hempel had done to her. Whatever Hempel had done to her, no one was going to crap on Fearless's reputation if Honor could help it. She forced her muscles to a knot as Nimitz's burr hummed against her. She'd never been able to decide what else he did, but the mysterious extra sense of his had to be at the bottom of it, for she felt her outrage fading into determination and knew darn well it wasn't all her doing. Her mind began to pick and pry at the problem. It was not to refuse a challenge. If there was a way to bring off